On that sweltering June morning, the Moroccan sun was already punishing the ancient stones of Rabat when Samira left her house with her heart overflowing with rage. The dense air carried the aroma of spices from the nearby market, but she barely noticed the beauty of her hometown. Her eyes were fixed on a single scene that made her blood boil. Her husband Idris, pushing that worn cart through the central square, his calloused hands firmly gripping the rusty metal bars. "How can I walk beside a man who lives smelling like oil and smoke?" she thought, biting her lower lip hard enough to leave a mark. The thin fabric of her blue dress stuck to her body due to the heat, but what really bothered her was the feeling of social suffocation she felt whenever she saw Idris working. Her eyes scanned her husband's hunched figure as he carefully arranged the pastries in the cart, and a wave of shame invaded her like a violent tide. She could not imagine in that moment of cruel judgment that the very shame consuming her would transform into the greatest regret of her entire life, that in a few months she would be crying bitter tears, begging forgiveness for having been so blind, so superficial, so cruelly unfair to the man who silently loved not only her, but an entire community of the needy. Destiny has a peculiar way of teaching us lessons, and the lesson awaiting Samira would be so powerful that it would change not only her perspective about her husband, but about the very meaning of human dignity. The morning heat seemed to intensify her frustration as she watched other women walking alongside their husbands, men in clean shirts heading to air-conditioned offices, carrying briefcases that spoke of respectability and success. Meanwhile, there was Idris, her husband of 7 years, pushing a food cart like countless other street vendors scattered throughout the city. The contrast felt like a personal insult to her aspirations. What Samira couldn't see, blinded as she was by social conventions and material desires, was that she was witnessing something far more noble than any office job could ever represent. She was observing a man who had chosen honesty over shortcuts, dignity over deception, service over selfishness. But those qualities, which would have made any woman proud, were invisible to her eyes, clouded by shallow ambitions. Idris Ben Ahmed was 38 years old, with hands that told the story of a lifetime dedicated to honest work. Each callus, each mark, each scar was a silent testimony to his unwavering determination to support his family through the sweat of his own brow. He woke up every morning at 4:30 a.m., even before the first call to prayer, and began preparing the pastries he would sell on the busy streets of Rabat. They lived in Hay Riyadh, a simple but dignified neighborhood where white houses lined up like teeth in a modest smile. Their residence was small, with only 3 rooms but always clean and organized. Samira took care of the house with care, but her heart was constantly restless, always wanting something more, something she believed life owed her. The couple had married 7 years earlier in a modest ceremony at the neighborhood mosque. At the time, Samira saw in Idris a hard-working and honest man, qualities her mother always said were the most important in a husband. But over the years, especially after her friends began marrying men with more respectable professions, engineers, teachers, merchants with their own stores, she began to feel she had settled for too little. Before continuing with this tragic but true story, you who are reading this must understand that this narrative teaches us about universal values that transcend borders. Wherever you are in the world, this lesson about dignity and character applies to your reality. Idris's work began early and ended late. He pushed his cart through the main streets of the city, stopping at strategic points where he knew he would find loyal customers. He knew many of his regular buyers by name, asked about their families, remembered small details about their lives. For him, it wasn't just a commercial transaction, it was a human connection, a service provided to the community. But Samira saw only a man dirty with oil, in simple clothes, pushing a noisy cart. She didn't see the nobility in his work, the dignity in his persistence, the beauty in his unwavering honesty. The depth of Idris's character revealed itself in small details that Samira had learned to overlook. When elderly customers struggled to reach into their pockets for money, he would wait patiently, never showing impatience or annoyance. When children approached his cart with wide eyes but empty pockets, he would discreetly slip them a small treat, pretending he hadn't noticed. When fellow vendors faced difficulties, he was always ready to lend a helping hand or share valuable advice about the best locations and times for sales. His reputation in the community was built on years of consistent kindness and reliability. Restaurant owners knew they could trust him to deliver fresh ingredients, Office workers counted on him being at the same corner every day for their lunch break. Mothers trusted him to serve clean, healthy food to their children. But to Samira, these relationships were merely evidence of his low social status, rather than proof of his admirable character. The deterioration of their relationship began subtly, like an almost imperceptible crack that gradually transforms into an abyss. Samira began avoiding going out with Idris, especially at times or places where she might encounter acquaintances. When they were invited to weddings or family celebrations, she would invent elaborate excuses not to attend together with her husband. "I have a headache," she would say, dramatically holding her forehead. "Go ahead, give my regards to the family." Idris, always gentle, accepted these excuses without question, but there was a growing sadness in his brown eyes that Samira chose to ignore. On the rare occasions when they went out together, she would walk a few steps ahead or behind, avoiding giving the impression that they were together. If they encountered neighbors or acquaintances, she would respond to questions about Idris vaguely and uncomfortably. "He's fine, working as always," she would say quickly, changing the subject as fast as possible. For Samira, being the wife of a street vendor had become too heavy a burden to bear. She began daydreaming about a different life, elegant clothes hanging in her wardrobe, jewelry sparkling on her neck, sophisticated parties where she could show off alongside a respectable husband. She spent hours browsing social media, looking at photos of old school classmates who had made it in life, as she would say with bitterness. In her fantasies, she saw herself in expensive restaurants, being courted by men in suits and ties, driving luxury cars, living in upscale neighborhoods. The reality of her life, a simple house, a hard-working husband, a modest but dignified routine, had become a golden prison from which she desperately wanted to escape. She began complaining about everything: the small house, the lack of money for new clothes, the classless neighbors, the monotonous life she led. Her complaints were constant and always accompanied by painful comparisons. "Fatima married a doctor and now lives in Agdal. Aicha gets a new car every month. I deserve better than this." The poison of discontent began affecting every aspect of their daily life. Samira would scrutinize other couples at social gatherings, mentally cataloguing the professions and possessions of other husbands. She developed an acute awareness of brands, status symbols, and social hierarchies that had never bothered her before marriage. What had once been a content and grateful heart became a breeding ground for resentment and endless comparisons. Her conversations with friends became exercises in subtle competition, where she would downplay her own circumstances while exaggerating any small luxury or achievement. When friends asked about Idris, she would give evasive answers or quickly redirect the conversation to other topics. The pride she had once felt in his work ethic and kindness was completely eclipsed by her embarrassment about his profession. The marriage that had once been filled with laughter and complicity was now dominated by tense silence and bitter recriminations. Idris felt his wife's distancing like a physical pain in his chest, but his gentle and patient nature prevented him from confronting her directly. Instead, he tried to compensate by working even harder, naively believing that if he could earn more money, perhaps he could win back Samira's love and respect. Family meals, which had once been moments of connection and sharing, became uncomfortable encounters marked by acid comments and disapproving looks. Samira served dinner in silence, her face a mask of forced resignation, while Idris desperately tried to start conversations about his workday, about customers he had met, about small events that had once interested them both. "Today I met a French tourist who loved our pastries," he would say, trying to brighten the atmosphere. "He said he had never tasted anything so delicious. He even asked for the recipe," Samira would respond with a snort and a headshake that made her total disinterest clear. "Good for you," she would mutter, without taking her eyes off her plate. The lack of emotional support from his wife began to weigh on Idris in increasingly evident ways. His shoulders seemed more hunched at the end of each day. His eyes lost some of the brightness that had once characterized them. But even so, every night he came home with small gifts for her, a special sweet that had been left over from the cart, a flower he had bought from a street vendor, a colorful scarf he had seen in a shop and thought would suit her. Samira received these gestures with growing indifference, sometimes not even bothering to thank him. She interpreted these offerings not as demonstrations of love, but as constant reminders of the modest life they led, of the social position they occupied, of the distance between their reality and her dreams of grandeur. Still, Idris persisted in his routine of silent dedication. Every night, no matter how exhausted he was, he came home bringing fresh bread from the neighborhood bakery and fruits he had gotten for a good price at the market. He made sure there was never anything lacking at home, that the bills were always paid on time, that Samira had everything she needed to live with dignity and comfort. The emotional distance began manifesting in physical ways as well. Samira would flinch when Idris tried to hold her hand, claiming his hands were too rough or smelled of work. She would turn away when he attempted to kiss her, making excuses about being tired or not feeling well. Their conversations became limited to household logistics and necessary arrangements, devoid of the warmth and intimacy that had once characterized their relationship. Idris began spending more time at the mosque, seeking solace in prayer and community. He would often be found after evening prayers, sitting quietly in contemplation, wrestling with the pain of his wife's rejection while trying to maintain his faith that things would improve. His friends at the mosque began to notice his increased devotion and the sadness that seemed to follow him like a shadow. What Samira didn't know, and perhaps would never suspect in her darkest moments of judgment, was that Idris kept a secret that revealed the true nobility of his soul, a secret that transformed his apparent simplicity into a moral grandeur that few possess, a secret that made him not just a humble merchant, but a true guardian of the needy in his community. Every night after closing the day's accounts and setting aside the money needed for household expenses and the next day's ingredient replenishment, Idris performed a ritual he kept in absolute secrecy. He would take a significant portion of his profits, often more than he could afford, and divide them into small, carefully prepared envelopes. 2 of these envelopes were destined for Khadija and Zainab, 2 widows who lived on streets adjacent to his. Khadija had lost her husband in a work accident 2 years earlier and struggled to raise 3 small children alone. Zainab, older, had been widowed 5 years ago and lived on a miserable pension that barely covered the rent of her small house. For these women, Idris's discreet help meant the difference between having food on the table or going to bed hungry. But Idris's secret extended beyond the neighborhood widows. A substantial portion of his earnings went to Dar al-Amal, House of Hope, a modest school that cared for orphans and abandoned children in the neighborhood. The institution operated on minimal resources, depending entirely on community donations to keep its doors open and feed the children it sheltered. The school's director, Hajj Mustafa, a 60-year-old man with a white beard and kind eyes, knew Idris well and appreciated his silent generosity. He never wants recognition, he would tell anyone who asked about the school's benefactors. He shows up here every Friday, leaves an amount that I know weighs on his budget, plays with the children for a few minutes, and leaves as if he hadn't done anything special. Idris's routine was always the same. After work, he would quickly stop by home to leave the cart and change clothes, invent some excuse for Samira. I'm going to the mosque. I need to buy something at the pharmacy. I'm going to visit my cousin, and set out through the city on his secret mission of kindness. The scope of his generosity was truly remarkable for someone of his modest means. Beyond the regular recipients, he maintained an informal network of support that extended to families facing temporary crises. When a neighbor's child needed medicine, when an elderly person couldn't afford groceries, when a family faced unexpected expenses, somehow word would reach Idris, and help would appear discreetly, often delivered through intermediaries so the recipients never knew the source. His generosity wasn't limited to money. During Ramadan, he would prepare extra portions of food for breaking the fast, distributing them to families who couldn't afford proper meals. In winter, he would quietly collect warm clothing and blankets, ensuring that no one in his extended circle of care would suffer from the cold. When the rains came and some of the poorer houses developed leaks, Idris would organize and fund small repair efforts, again maintaining strict anonymity about his role. While Samira consumed herself with dreams of luxury and social status, Idris carried on his shoulders an invisible weight that she could never perceive. It was the weight of genuine responsibility, the sacred burden of those who choose to put others' needs before their own desires, the moral load of the truly generous. Many nights after distributing his donations and arriving home, Idris would content himself with a piece of bread and sweet tea while watching Samira eat the complete meal he had provided for her. It wasn't due to lack of food, there was always enough for both, but because he had developed the habit of eating less so he could give more. When Samira complained that they didn't have enough money to buy a new dress or renovate the house decoration, Idris would listen in silence, knowing he could easily meet these desires if he redirected the money he allocated to charity. But for him, there was no real choice. The basic survival needs of the widows and orphans he helped were infinitely more important than his own family's desires for additional comfort. This invisible weight manifested in subtle ways that only a very attentive observer could notice. Idris had developed the habit of discreetly checking the prices of everything before buying anything, not out of greed, but because every dirham saved could become an extra meal for an orphaned child or medicine for a sick widow. His clothes, though always clean and well-maintained, were few and simple. He owned only 2 work pants, 3 shirts, and 1 jacket for special occasions. When a piece wore out too much, he would carefully mend it instead of replacing it immediately. Samira saw this as a sign of poverty or lack of ambition, not realizing it was actually a conscious choice by someone who had found purpose in serving others. Idris's shoes told their own story. They were sturdy and practical, but clearly old and patched. He walked kilometers every day pushing his cart, and his feet suffered the consequences. Several times he considered buying a new pair, but always ended up giving up when he thought about how many meals that money could provide at the House of Hope. The physical toll of his double life, working long hours to support his family while secretly maintaining his charitable activities, was evident to those who knew how to look. His face, though always bearing a gentle smile for customers and those he helped, showed lines of fatigue that spoke of sleepless nights spent planning how to stretch his resources further. His hands, already rough from cart pushing and food preparation, bore additional calluses from the extra hours he worked to fund his generosity. Yet, despite this burden, Idris never showed resentment or self-pity. He had found a sense of purpose that transcended personal comfort, a mission that gave meaning to every difficult day and every sacrifice. In his quiet moments of prayer, he would thank Allah for the opportunity to serve, viewing his ability to help others not as a burden but as a blessing and a test of his faith. It was on a particularly hot September afternoon that destiny decided to intervene in Samira's life in a way she could never have predicted. On that day, her suspicions and paranoia reached a boiling point that led her to make a decision that would change her life forever. Samira had noticed that Idris frequently arrived home later than necessary, always with excuses she considered vague and unconvincing. "I stopped to talk with a customer. I had to help Ahmed with his cart. I stopped at the mosque for Maghrib prayer." These explanations fueled a growing distrust in her heart, already hardened by resentment. On that fateful afternoon, she made a decision that would shame her for the rest of her life. She would secretly follow Idris to discover what he really did in his spare time. In her jealous and distrustful mind, she had constructed elaborate scenarios of betrayal. Perhaps he had a second wife or a mistress, or maybe he was spending money on gambling or other activities she considered unworthy. She dressed in a dark jalaba and covered her hair so she could easily blend into the street crowds. Her heart beat rapidly, a mixture of anticipated anger and morbid excitement for the confirmation she believed she was about to receive. She positioned herself strategically on a corner where she could observe the spot where Idris usually parked his cart at the end of the day. When she saw him arriving, pushing the cart with the same determination as always, she hid behind a parked car and waited. She watched him methodically organizing his utensils, carefully cleaning the cart surfaces, counting the day's money. Everything seemed normal until he did something unexpected. Instead of heading home as usual, he took a completely different direction. Samira followed him at a safe distance, her heart racing with each corner they turned. They walked for about 15 minutes until they reached an area of the neighborhood she rarely visited, where the houses were even more modest than hers, where the streets were narrower and the people clearly poorer. What she saw from that moment on left her completely paralyzed. Idris stopped in front of a small whitewashed house where a middle-aged woman with 3 small children waited at the door. He took an envelope from his pocket and discreetly handed it to the woman, who received it with tears in her eyes and gratitude so evident that even from a distance Samira could perceive it. But this was just the beginning. During the next hour, she accompanied Idris on a journey that would forever shatter her illusions about who he really was. She saw him repeat the same scene at another house, where an elderly lady awaited him, with the anxiety of someone who knows their survival depends on others' kindness. She saw him stop at a small school where poorly dressed children ran to greet him as if he were a hero returning from a great adventure. The realization of the truth hit Samira like lightning on a clear afternoon. There was her husband, the man she despised for his simplicity, revealing himself as a true prince in disguise, not of material wealth, but of moral wealth. Each envelope he delivered, each smile he received, each tear of gratitude he provoked, all painted a portrait of a man she had completely failed to recognize. The scene at the House of Hope particularly moved her. She watched as children who clearly knew and loved Idris surrounded him with genuine joy. They showed him their drawings, told him about their school progress, and received his gentle attention with the hunger of children who had been deprived of parental love. Seeing her husband in this role, as a father figure to the fatherless, revealed an aspect of his character that she had never even imagined existed. As she continued to observe, Samira began to understand the systematic nature of his generosity. This wasn't random charity or occasional kindness. It was a carefully organized network of support that he had built and maintained over years. The efficiency with which he moved from location to location, the familiarity with which people greeted him, the obvious expectation and relief on the faces of those he helped. All of this spoke to a long-standing commitment that had been completely invisible to her. That same night, still trembling from the impact of the revelations she had witnessed, Samira arrived home before Idris and sat in the kitchen, trying to process the revolution happening in her understanding of the man with whom she had shared a bed for 7 years. Her hands shook as she prepared tea, her nightly ritual that now seemed loaded with completely new meaning. When Idris finally arrived, with that same tired but serene expression she had learned to ignore, she could barely look into his eyes. How had she been so blind? How had she so wrongly interpreted the signs of greatness that now seemed so obvious to her? He washed his hands at the kitchen sink as he did every night, and sat at the small table where she had placed a simple plate of tagine and fresh bread. "How was your day, Habibti?" he asked with the same gentleness as always, using the affectionate term she had begun to consider inappropriate for someone of his social position. Samira mumbled an evasive response, still unable to fully process what she had discovered. But fate had not finished exposing the truth to her. Around 9 o'clock, 3 soft knocks on the door interrupted the tense silence that had settled over the house. Idris got up to answer, and Samira followed him discreetly, curious to see who was visiting them at such a late hour. When the door opened, it revealed one of the women Samira had seen receiving a donation a few hours earlier, Khadija, though Samira didn't yet know her name. The widow held in her hands a small plate covered with a clean cloth, and her eyes shone with tears of sincere gratitude. "Sidi Idris," she said, using the respectful title that demonstrated the esteem she had for him, "forgive me for bothering you so late, but I needed to thank you personally. With your help today, I was able to buy medicine for my little daughter. She had a fever for 2 days and I didn't know what to do." Idris, visibly uncomfortable with public thanks, tried to minimize his gesture. "It was nothing, my sister. Any Muslim would do the same. How is little Aisha now?" "Much better, alhamdulillah. And I brought you some of the couscous I made today. It's little, but it's made with all the love of my heart." Samira watched this exchange of courtesies from her hiding place behind the kitchen door, and each word was like a dagger piercing her previous illusions. The reality of who her husband really was, not just a street vendor, but a silent pillar of the community, a man whose generosity touched lives in ways she had never imagined, began to solidify in her mind in a way that left her both proud and deeply ashamed. When Khadija left and Idris returned to the kitchen, he found Samira standing in the middle of the room, with tears silently running down her face. It was the first time in months she had cried in front of him, and the first time in years that these tears were not of anger or frustration, but of something much deeper and more complex. "What's wrong, Samira?" he asked, immediately concerned. "Are you feeling unwell?" She couldn't answer immediately. How could she explain that she was crying because she had finally seen the truth? How could she confess that she had spent years despising a man who deserved her deepest admiration? How could she admit that while she dreamed of a different husband, she already had an extraordinary man disguised as simplicity in her home? The weight of her realization was overwhelming. For years, she had been living with a saint and treating him like a burden. She had been blessed with a husband whose character would have made him worthy of praise in any society, in any era, yet she had been too blinded by superficial concerns to recognize his worth. The magnitude of her mistake, of the years of coldness and contempt she had shown to such a good man, crashed over her like a tsunami of regret. A week after that transformative moment, fate provided Samira with an even more public and humbling lesson about her husband's true nature. It was a Friday, the day of congregational prayer. And although Samira didn't usually attend the mosque regularly, that day she felt an inexplicable need to accompany Idris to the Al-Nur mosque in the neighborhood. The religious building was simple but welcoming, with its white walls adorned by Arabic calligraphy in blue and gold. The Imam Haj Omar, a man of about 50 with a carefully trimmed beard and eyes that radiated wisdom, was respected by the entire community for his touching sermons and dedication to the most needy. Samira positioned herself in the women's section of the mosque, separated from the men by an elegant carved wooden divider. From there she could see Idris sitting humbly among the other faithful, his simple but clean clothes, contrasting with the more elaborate attire of some of the more prosperous merchants in the region. That day's sermon had as its theme, true wealth in Allah's eyes, and Samira listened to every word with attention she hadn't shown in years. The Imam spoke about how modern society had distorted the concept of success, prioritizing appearance over substance, social status over moral character. "My brothers and sisters," said the Imam with his strong, clear voice that echoed through the mosque walls, "we live in times when we measure a man's value by the size of his house, by the model of his car, by the brand of his clothes. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us that the true measure of a person lies in their actions, in their generosity, in their willingness to help those most in need." Samira felt as if each word were directed specifically at her, as if the Imam could read her most intimate thoughts and deepest moral failures. But the moment that would truly shake her soul was yet to come. In the middle of his sermon about charity and humility, the Imam did something that transformed that ordinary Friday into an unforgettable moment in Samira's life. "I want to share with you," said the Imam, making a dramatic pause, "a concrete example of the silent generosity that our religion values so much. Among us is a man who for years has been a true guardian of the needy in our community. He doesn't seek recognition, doesn't boast about his good deeds, doesn't expect public thanks." Samira felt her heart accelerate, a growing intuition about what was coming. "This man," continued the Imam, "works honestly during the day to support his family, and then, with what could be his well-deserved rest, dedicates time and resources to care for widows, orphans, those forgotten by society. He is a living example of what it means to follow the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him." And then the moment that would make Samira remember that day for the rest of her life. "Brother Idris ben Ahmed," said the Imam, pointing directly to where her husband sat, "may Allah abundantly bless your generous hands and charitable soul. You are a light in our community, an example we should all follow." The entire mosque turned to look at Idris, who was visibly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. Murmurs of approval and admiration spread among the faithful, and several people began to applaud discreetly, respecting the sacred environment, but demonstrating their genuine approval. "Masha Allah," people whispered around. "May Allah reward him," said an elderly lady near Samira. "This is how a true Muslim should be," commented another. Samira felt as if the ground would disappear beneath her feet. There she was in Allah's house, hearing hundreds of people express admiration and respect for the man she had spent years belittling. The contrast between the community's perception of Idris and her own distorted view of him was so glaring that she felt physically sick. While the discreet applause continued, and people stood up to greet Idris with respectful handshakes and warm embraces, Samira lowered her head, consumed by shame so deep it seemed to burn her from within. Tears came without warning, silent but abundant, each one carrying years of regret and late recognition. How had she been so blind? How had she so wrongly interpreted the signs of greatness that now seemed so obvious? How had she wasted so many years being a source of displeasure to a man who deserved only admiration and support? The public nature of this recognition made her humiliation complete. Not only had she failed to appreciate her husband's worth, but apparently everyone else in their community had recognized it. She had been the only one blind to his virtues, the only one who had seen shame where others saw honor, burden where others saw blessing. Samira's transformation didn't happen overnight. Like all true and lasting changes, it was a gradual process, sometimes painful, but deeply necessary. It began the morning after that devastating sermon, when she woke up with swollen eyes from crying so much and an iron determination to rebuild not only her perception of her husband, but of herself. For the first time in years, she woke up before Idris and prepared breakfast with special care that she had abandoned long ago. When he came down to the kitchen, surprised to find the table set with his favorite dishes, and the aroma of fresh bread in the air, she greeted him with a shy but genuine smile. "Sabah al-khair, Habibi," she said, using the affectionate term she had avoided for so long. "I thought I'd prepare something special for you today." Idris looked at her with surprise and understandable caution. After years of coldness and indifference, this sudden change in behavior left him confused, though hopeful. "Shukran, Samira," he replied gently. "Everything is delicious, but is there something different today?" She took a deep breath, gathering courage for what she needed to say. "Idris, I need to ask your forgiveness for many things, for years of things." The following days marked the beginning of a transformation that would surprise not only Idris, but the entire neighborhood. Samira began to show genuine interest in her husband's work for the first time since they married. She asked about his customers, about the pastry recipes, about the daily challenges of working on Rabat's streets. But the most significant change came when she expressed a desire to accompany him to work. "I want to help," she said one morning, while watching him prepare the day's ingredients. "I want to better understand what you do. I want to be part of it." Idris was initially hesitant. He knew how ashamed Samira felt about his work, and feared this was just a passing phase, a momentary impulse that would soon dissipate. But there was something different in her eyes, a sincerity he hadn't seen in years, that convinced him to accept her offer. Samira's first morning working alongside Idris was revealing in ways she had never anticipated. She discovered the art and science behind the work she had belittled for so long. She learned about the importance of keeping food at the correct temperature, about how to interact with customers of different personalities, about the simple but profound satisfaction of providing a tasty meal to someone hungry. More importantly, she witnessed firsthand the reputation Idris had built over the years. Customer after customer greeted him by name, asked about his family, shared small details of their own lives. She saw teachers running during break time to buy a quick snack, but always finding time for a friendly conversation, construction workers who saved money during the week to allow themselves one of Idris's special pastries on Fridays, university students who treated him like a beloved uncle. "Your husband is a special man," a regular customer told her, a nurse from the nearby hospital. "He always has a smile, always asks how we're doing. On difficult days at the hospital, knowing I'll find his kindness out here helps me continue." These words touched Samira deeply. She began to see that Idris's work wasn't just about selling food, it was about creating human connections, about being a point of light in people's daily routines, about serving the community in a way that transcended simple commercial transactions. But Samira's true transformation came when she began actively participating in Idris's secret charity missions. Initially, she just accompanied him, observing from a distance while he made his discreet deliveries, but gradually she began contributing ideas, suggestions, and eventually her own labor. She suggested preparing extra portions of soup during winter to distribute to needy families. She organized a small clothing drive among the neighbor women for the children at the House of Hope. She began regularly visiting Khadija and Zainab, not just as the wife of their benefactor, but as a genuine friend who cared about their well-being. At the House of Hope, Samira discovered a vocation she didn't know she possessed. The orphaned children, initially shy with the presence of a new woman, soon became attached to her. She began helping with homework, telling stories, teaching small domestic skills to the older girls. Aunt Samira, the children called her, a title she came to value more than any compliment about her appearance or material possessions she had received in the past. This new routine of serving others brought to Samira's life a sense of purpose and fulfillment she had never experienced in her dreams of luxury and social status. She discovered there was infinitely greater dignity in being useful, in making a difference in others' lives, in being part of something greater than her own desires. 3 months after the beginning of her transformation, fate presented Samira and Idris with a test that would definitively define how deep the change in their values and priorities had been. It was a December morning, when Rabat's cold air made street work even more challenging, and they were organizing the cart in the central square when an extraordinary incident occurred. Idris had just served a customer and was putting away the change when he noticed something unusual on the ground near one of the cart's wheels. It was a brown leather wallet, clearly expensive and well-maintained, that someone had dropped without noticing. He picked it up discreetly and opened it to try to identify the owner. What he found inside left him breathless. There were at least 5,000 dirhams in carefully organized bills, several credit cards, and an identity document revealing that the wallet belonged to Mohammed Benjaloun, a well-known businessman in the city, owner of a chain of electronics stores. For a family that struggled monthly to balance household accounts with charitable commitments, that amount represented a small fortune. It was enough money to pay off all pending debts, buy new clothes, perhaps even make some home improvements that Samira had desired for so long. Idris showed the wallet discreetly to Samira, and for a moment both remained silent, processing the magnitude of the situation. It was as if the universe were testing the sincerity of her transformation, offering exactly what she had desired for years: financial resources to elevate their standard of living, but in a way that challenged the moral values she had recently embraced. The old Samira, the one who dreamed of luxuries and was ashamed of her husband's simplicity, would have seen in that moment a divine opportunity. She could have rationalized 1,000 ways to justify keeping the money. Nobody saw. This rich man won't even miss it. We deserve this after so much time helping others. It's as if Allah were rewarding us. But the woman Samira had become, transformed by months of discoveries about the true nature of dignity and wealth, reacted in a way that surprised even herself. Without hesitation, without even considering other possibilities, she looked directly into Idris's eyes and said with a conviction that echoed through the square, "Return it, Idris. What Allah gives us with honesty is worth more than any fortune." Her words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, the certainty of someone who had learned to distinguish between what glitters and what truly has value. She had discovered that the peace of mind that came from moral integrity was a treasure infinitely more precious than any amount of money. Idris smiled, a smile of pride and love that illuminated his entire face. In that moment, he knew that the woman he had married years before had finally returned, transformed and matured by her experiences, but fundamentally the same kind person he had loved since their first meeting. Together, they set out in search of the wallet's owner. They discovered that Mohammed Benjaloun had a store just a few streets away, and walked there carrying not only the lost wallet, but also a renewed sense of shared purpose. When they delivered the wallet to the businessman, his reaction was one of total amazement. "Do you know how much money was in here?" he asked, incredulous. "Most people would have kept at least part of it." "Sir," Idris replied with simplicity, "it wasn't ours. Allah blesses us in many ways, but never through dishonesty." The businessman, touched by the couple's integrity, insisted on offering a substantial reward, but Idris and Samira politely declined. "Doing the right thing is its own reward," said Samira, words she never imagined would come from her mouth just months before. This experience further strengthened the bond between the couple and consolidated Samira's transformation. She had passed the final test, proving to herself and the world that her change was genuine and lasting. 6 months had passed since that sweltering morning when Samira had left home consumed by shame for her husband. Now, on an equally hot morning, she walked through the same central square, but everything had changed, not the scenery, but her perspective on it. She watched Idris pushing the same cart, serving the same customers, performing the same honest work as always. But where she had once seen cause for shame, she now saw a source of deep and genuine pride. Each satisfied customer was a confirmation of her husband's character quality. Each smile he drew from a child buying candy was evidence of his natural goodness. Each friendly conversation he maintained with area workers demonstrated his ability to genuinely connect with people. The woman who had once avoided walking beside Idris now walked proudly at his side, not just tolerating, but completely embracing the work he did and the life they had built together. She had learned that dignity doesn't come from the work one does, but from how one does any work. She had discovered that true wealth isn't measured in material possessions, but in meaningful relationships, life purpose, and inner peace. Samira's transformation echoed throughout the entire community. Young women who had once seen her as an example of frustrated ambition now sought her out for advice on how to find satisfaction in the life they had, instead of wasting energy dreaming of lives they didn't possess. She became a vocal advocate for the idea that all honest work deserves respect, regardless of its social prestige. At the House of Hope, her involvement had evolved from occasional visitor to mother figure for many of the children. She organized a tutoring program where women from the community volunteered time to help with the children's studies. She created a small garden where children learned about responsibility by caring for plants. She established a support network among the neighborhood widows, providing not only material assistance, but also companionship and emotional support. Idris, in turn, flourished under his wife's renewed support. With Samira working alongside him, they managed to slightly expand the business, offering additional varieties of snacks and establishing an even more loyal clientele. But more important than financial growth was the spiritual growth both experienced working together toward shared goals. Their donations to needy families and the House of Hope became more organized and efficient with Samira's contribution. She brought a feminine perspective to understanding the specific needs of widows and their daughters, while her attention to detail helped maximize the impact of every dirham donated. The story of their transformation spread through the community, becoming an inspiring example of how people can change, grow, and find their true purpose in life. Young couples sought advice from Samira and Idris on how to build relationships based on solid values instead of superficial expectations. During women's meetings at the mosque, Samira frequently shared her experience, always emphasizing that real change begins with the humility to recognize one's own mistakes and the courage to correct them. Allah gave me an extraordinary husband from the beginning, she would say, but I was so blinded by worldly desires that I almost lost the greatest treasure of my life. Imam Haj Omar occasionally cited the couple's story in his sermons, always with their permission, as a contemporary example of how true happiness comes from aligning our actions with our highest values. On a particularly clear night, when they were sitting on their small veranda watching the stars after a particularly productive day of work and charity, Samira held Idris's calloused hand and said, "Habibi, thank you for never giving up on me. Thank you for allowing me to discover who I really could be." Idris squeezed her hand with tenderness and replied, "Samira, you were always this wonderful person. You just needed to find your way back to her." They remained in comfortable silence, two hearts that had learned that true wealth isn't in having more but in being more. That authentic dignity doesn't come from others' recognition, but from the peace we find when we live according to our deepest values. The lesson they learned, and now shared with all who were willing to listen, was simple but profound. Allah honors those who live with integrity, regardless of their social position or material wealth. True elevation comes from character, not circumstances, and genuine happiness is found not in satisfying infinite desires for more, but in finding contentment and purpose in what we already possess, and in how we can use our blessings to serve others. The story of Samira and Idris became a powerful reminder for the entire community that often life's greatest treasures are right before our eyes, waiting only for us to have the wisdom to recognize them and the courage to value them properly. Their marriage, once on the brink of collapse due to misplaced priorities and shallow judgments, had become stronger than ever. They had learned that love isn't just an emotion, but a choice, a daily decision to see the best in each other, to support each other's growth, and to work together towards something greater than individual desires. The respect Samira now commanded in the community wasn't based on her husband's profession or their material possessions, but on her character, her service to others, and her visible transformation from a bitter, dissatisfied woman into someone who radiated contentment and purpose. She had become living proof that it's never too late to change, never too late to recognize our mistakes, and never too late to choose a better path. As for Idris, his quiet dignity had finally been recognized and celebrated, not just by his wife, but by everyone who knew their story. Yet this recognition didn't change him. He remained the same humble, generous man he had always been, continuing his work with the same dedication and his charity with the same discretion. This story teaches us that true transformation begins when we stop judging people's value by appearances and start seeing the beauty of character. May each of us have the humility to question our prejudices and the wisdom to value what truly matters in life: integrity, generosity, and genuine love. In a world obsessed with status and material success, let us remember that the greatest riches are often found in the simplest acts of human kindness and the quiet dignity of honest work.